The story of Hawley Harvey Crippen doesn't begin with drama or sensational headlines. It's a quiet story that unfolds slowly in the ordinary streets of London, in the everyday life of a man who seemed destined to remain completely unremarkable. He was the kind of person you might pass on the street without really noticing. He was neither particularly striking nor especially memorable, just an ordinary man going about his daily business. Yet beneath this ordinary surface lay secrets and complexities that would eventually come to light in ways no one could have predicted. This is the story of a man whose name would become infamous, though few people who knew him during those quiet years could have imagined such a fate. What follows is an account of how an ordinary life would take an extraordinary turn, and how one man's world would eventually captivate public attention like few cases before or since. Hawley Harvey Crippen was born on the 11th of September, 1862, in the small town of Coldwater, Michigan. He was the only surviving child of Andra Skinner and Myron Augustus Crippen, a merchant whose business provided the family with modest comfort and some respect within their community. From the beginning, young Hawley displayed a quiet and reserved nature. He wasn't the type of boy who sought attention or tried to win people over with charm or boldness. Instead, he was thoughtful and conscientious, the kind of student who worked steadily at his studies and applied himself with quiet dedication. When he grew up, Crippen attended the University of Michigan, where he chose to study homeopathy, a medical practice that would define his professional life for the next 4 decades. In the late 1800s, homeopathy occupied a complex position in the medical world. To its believers and practitioners, it represented a more thoughtful approach to healing, based on careful observation and the principle that substances causing certain symptoms in healthy people could cure those same symptoms in sick people. To mainstream doctors in universities and hospitals, however, homeopathy seemed questionable and was often dismissed as unscientific. Crippen became deeply committed to homeopathic principles, though he was well aware of the skepticism it faced from the wider medical community. The basic concept of homeopathy was relatively straightforward. The theory held that a substance capable of producing symptoms similar to a disease in a healthy person could, when properly diluted and prepared, cure that same disease in a sick patient. This idea had ancient origins but was systematized by Samuel Hahnemann, a German physician, in the late 1700s as a reaction against the brutal medical practices of his time. The conventional medicine of that era was harsh and often dangerous to patients. Doctors regularly performed bloodletting, administered violent purges, and gave patients toxic substances in quantities that could cause serious harm or death. Mercury was commonly used to treat syphilis, but in such large amounts that it poisoned patients rather than cured them. Medical practice was based on the belief that disease had to be fought aggressively, that the body needed to be shocked back into health through force and trauma. The death rates from these treatments were often as high as the death rates from the diseases themselves. Homeopathy offered a gentler and more humane alternative to this brutal approach. It seemed to work with the body's natural healing abilities, rather than attempting to overwhelm disease through violence and poison. One of the most distinctive features of homeopathic treatment was the process of potentization, in which remedies were repeatedly diluted and shaken intensely. A substance would be diluted many times over, until sometimes no molecules of the original substance remained in the final preparation. Conventional doctors found this practice absurd and mocked it openly, arguing that if nothing of the original substance remained, the remedy could have no possible effect. Homeopathic practitioners, however, maintained that this process somehow enhanced the curative power of the remedies, even though they couldn't explain this through conventional chemistry. The homeopathic catalog of remedies was extensive and complex, containing hundreds of substances derived from plants, minerals, and animal sources, each with specific applications. During this period, homeopathy was gaining considerable popularity and acceptance, especially in America, where it offered trained practitioners opportunities for professional success and financial security. After completing his initial studies in Michigan, Crippen continued his medical training at the Cleveland Homeopathic Medical College, from which he graduated in 1884. His education provided him with thorough knowledge of homeopathic principles and practical clinical experience. He spent considerable time studying the Materia Medica, the comprehensive reference guide listing remedies and their applications, and learning how to take detailed patient histories. Armed with his credentials and genuine expertise, Crippen began practicing as a homeopathic physician in New York City during the mid-1880s. The work proved steady and rewarding, and New York's large population provided good opportunities for an ambitious doctor willing to build a practice through hard work. In his practice, Crippen treated patients suffering from common ailments of the time, including chronic digestive problems, nervous conditions, respiratory infections, and rheumatism. He would question patients carefully about their symptoms, consult his reference materials, and select the remedy he believed most suitable for each individual case. Homeopathic practice required a different approach than conventional medicine demanded of its practitioners. It required patience, careful listening, and genuine attention to patients' subjective experiences of their illness rather than dismissing their reports. For Crippen, who was by nature a serious and methodical person, homeopathy provided a professional framework that felt meaningful and ethical. But while Crippen was establishing his practice in New York, the medical profession was undergoing significant change. The discoveries of scientists like Pasteur and Koch, combined with advances in bacteriology, represented a fundamental shift in how disease was understood. Disease was increasingly seen not as a mysterious imbalance of vital forces, but as the result of specific microorganisms that could be identified under a microscope and potentially treated with specific remedies. This scientific approach seemed far more precise and credible than homeopathy's emphasis on subtle symptom patterns and vital energy. Mainstream medicine consolidated its authority during this period, establishing formal standards for medical education and licensing. Practitioners of alternative medical systems found themselves increasingly marginalized and excluded from mainstream medical practice. While America still had considerable support for homeopathy and homeopathic practitioners, England's medical establishment was even more rigid and conservative in its attitudes. Homeopathy occupied a much more precarious position in England and faced significant resistance from the medical establishment. It was during his years in New York that Crippen married Charlotte Jane Bell, a union that seemed to promise a respectable and conventional future. The marriage appeared promising, and the couple had a son together, Hawley Otto, born in 1889. For several years, it seemed that Crippen's life was progressing along a conventional path, with a wife, a young son, a growing medical practice, and the prospect of building both professional success and family stability. Then in 1892, tragedy struck suddenly. Charlotte Jane suffered a severe stroke and died, leaving Crippen a widower at a relatively young age and forcing him to confront difficult decisions about his future and his son's care. Rather than attempt to raise his son alone while maintaining a demanding medical practice in New York, Crippen decided to entrust the boy's care to his parents, who had moved to San Jose, California. This decision meant that his son would grow up far away from him, and the separation would eventually create a permanent distance between father and child that would never be fully bridged. A few years later, in 1894, seeking companionship and emotional connection after his wife's death, Crippen married again. His second wife was Corinne Turner, born Kunigund Makamotsky, a woman of considerable theatrical ambition who performed in music halls under the stage name Belle Elmore. She possessed a vivacity and social charm that contrasted sharply with Crippen's quiet and reserved nature. Where his first marriage had been marked by domestic stability and routine, this second union seemed to promise excitement and connection to a world of entertainment and culture previously foreign to him. That same year, 1894, Crippen secured employment with James M. Munian, a prominent homeopathic physician whose business interests extended well beyond simple medical practice into the lucrative field of patent medicines. This represented a significant professional opportunity, offering prospects for advancement and financial security beyond what a private practice could provide. Munian's operation was substantial and expanding, with ambitions for national and international growth, and Crippen's employment seemed to offer genuine prospects for career advancement. 3 years later, in 1897, Money offered Crippen the position of managing the London branch office, a significant responsibility that represented confidence in Crippen's abilities. Crippen accepted eagerly, and he and Cora crossed the Atlantic that year, embarking for England with the hopes that animate many who undertake such journeys, hoping that a new country might offer fresh opportunities and that the limitations of the past might be left behind. London in the 1890s remained the center of a vast empire, a city of considerable wealth and sophistication, and to an ambitious man seeking professional advancement, it represented the possibility of moving onto a larger stage. Crippen possessed medical credentials, professional experience, and the backing of a successful businessman, and his prospects for success seemed genuinely promising. But the reality of England proved far more resistant to his ambitions than he had anticipated. His American medical credentials, despite their legitimacy and his genuine expertise in homeopathy, were viewed with little regard by the English medical establishment. The prestige associated with his training in America evaporated entirely once he crossed the Atlantic. The English medical world was insular and protective of its own credentials and traditions, and American qualifications counted for remarkably little. He found himself unable to practice medicine in the way he had in New York, unable to leverage his years of training and study into the kind of professional standing he had anticipated. Instead, he was reduced to continuing his work as a distributor of patent medicines, respectable enough work perhaps, but utterly removed from his original aspirations and training. The years that followed proved increasingly disappointing. In 1899, after only 2 years of managing Money's London office, Crippen was dismissed from his position. The exact reasons were never fully disclosed, but the effect was unmistakable. He was cast adrift in a foreign country without secure employment, forced to seek work wherever he could find it. The positions that followed were each slightly less prestigious than the last, each offering slightly less security and stability. He worked for various patent medicine companies, moving from one to another in a seemingly endless succession of disappointments. Each position represented another small failure, another reminder that his credentials and abilities were not being valued as he believed they deserved to be. This long period of professional wandering eventually led him to the Droit Institute for the Deaf, where he secured a position as manager. It was solid, respectable work, the kind of employment that a man of his education and training could perform competently and with professional dignity. The institute valued his abilities enough to have him create prescriptions that would later be considered significant enough to preserve in the Wellcome Collection, a prestigious repository of medical artifacts and documents. Yet despite this recognition of his professional competence, the position paid poorly. It provided enough income to maintain a modest household, but not enough to live comfortably, and certainly not enough to support the lifestyle that his wife, Cora, had grown increasingly accustomed to and demanded as her due. The evening of the 31st of January, 1910, began like any other social gathering at number 39 Hilldrop Crescent, though the guest list was modest and the entertainment subdued. The Crippens hosted parties from time to time, social occasions that reflected their particular position in society, respectable enough to maintain appearances but not grand enough to attract truly fashionable circles. Cora had invited several guests to the house that evening, people drawn from the theatrical and musical circles in which she moved, along with a few neighbors and local acquaintances. The gathering was unremarkable in most respects, the kind of evening that left little lasting impression on those who attended, memorable only for what would follow in its aftermath. Crippen endured the evening with characteristic quiet reserve, playing the role of dutiful host while maintaining his distance from the animated conversations swirling around him. Cora, by contrast, was energized and engaged, clearly in her element as the center of attention. She remained an attractive woman in her late 40s and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent her life performing and commanding attention through sheer force of personality. As the evening progressed and guests eventually departed into the London night, Crippen and Cora were left alone together in their house. What transpired between them in those final hours would never be known with certainty, though the evidence that would later emerge suggested a conversation of considerable intensity and finality. Whether it was a quarrel that escalated beyond his ability to control or a deliberate act undertaken with careful planning remained a mystery that would never be fully resolved. But by the following morning, Cora had vanished. When friends and acquaintances began asking about her absence in the days and weeks that followed, Crippen offered an explanation designed to satisfy curiosity without inviting further questions. His wife, he explained, had decided to return to the United States because she had grown homesick and could no longer bear to remain in England. The explanation seemed plausible on the surface, as many people did return to America, and Cora maintained connections to the American theatrical world. But as time passed with no word from Cora, and no letters or messages arrived from across the Atlantic to support Crippen's account, certain people who knew Cora well began to suspect something was wrong. It was Kate Vulcana Williams, a strongwoman who performed in music halls and had become friendly with Cora through their shared involvement in entertainment, who first brought the matter to Scotland Yard's attention. Vulcana, as she was known professionally, had known Cora for several years, and found it difficult to believe that her friend would simply leave for America without saying goodbye or sending any communication. Her concerns were taken seriously enough by Scotland Yard to warrant preliminary investigation, though the police were not yet sufficiently concerned to pursue the matter with great urgency. Missing persons cases were common in a city as large as London, and nothing on the surface suggested anything more serious than a woman who had simply chosen to relocate. But Cora's other friends, particularly the actress Lil Hawthorne and her husband John Nash, who served as her manager, were not satisfied with the police's apparent indifference. They pressed their acquaintance Superintendent Frank Frost of Scotland Yard to take the investigation more seriously. These were people who knew Cora well and understood her character and habits, and they could not believe she would disappear without explanation or contact. Their persistence eventually convinced the authorities that the matter warranted more serious investigation. On the 8th of July 1910, nearly 6 months after Cora's disappearance, Chief Inspector Walter Dew arrived at Hilldrop Crescent to question Crippen. Dew was an experienced investigator, seasoned in handling various criminal cases, and he approached his interview with Crippen with practiced courtesy mixed with professional skepticism. Under questioning, Crippen's story began to fall apart. He admitted that his earlier account had been false, that the story about his wife returning to America was not the truth. The real reason for Cora's absence, he now claimed, was that she had indeed left him, but not to return home to the United States. Instead, he alleged she had eloped with one of her lovers, a music hall actor named Bruce Miller. The shame and embarrassment of being abandoned by his wife for another man had been too much for Crippen to bear, he explained, which was why he had invented the story about her return to America as a way of preserving his dignity and avoiding the scandal that would have resulted from public knowledge of her infidelity and departure. The explanation was plausible in certain respects and carried psychological truth that would have resonated with an experienced investigator like Dew. Men did sometimes fabricate stories to cover the shame of marital failure and abandonment. Crippen's mild manner and apparent distress seemed to support his account. He consented to allow Dew to search the house, a cooperation that suggested an innocent man confident in his story's truthfulness. Dew conducted a thorough search of the premises, examining the rooms and outbuildings, but found nothing that contradicted Crippen's account or suggested anything improper had occurred. With no evidence of wrongdoing and with Crippen's apparently reasonable explanation for his wife's absence, Dew concluded his investigation and departed. But the police's departure did not end the matter, for Crippen and Ethel Leneve, now living together in the house, became increasingly convinced that Dew must have discovered something he hadn't revealed, that the police possessed more evidence than they had indicated. The anxiety that gripped Crippen following Dew's visit became unbearable, and he made the fateful decision to flee. Without careful planning, driven by panic and conviction that discovery was imminent, Crippen and Leneve prepared for hasty departure. They traveled first to Brussels, spending a night in a hotel there while attempting to determine their next move. Brussels seemed too close to England, too easily accessible to British authorities, and they decided they needed to place greater distance between themselves and Scotland Yard's reach. From Brussels, they traveled to Antwerp, where they secured passage aboard the SS Montrose, a Canadian Pacific liner bound for Canada. The ship was scheduled to depart within hours, and they boarded with whatever few possessions they had managed to gather, embarking on what they hoped would be an escape from the consequences of what had occurred at Hilldrop Crescent. The flight itself was extraordinary evidence of guilt, though Crippen seemed not to have fully considered this at the moment of his departure. An innocent man with nothing to hide would not have fled in such panic, would not have abandoned his home and livelihood and fled across the Atlantic. The police, upon learning of Crippen and Lenive's disappearance, immediately began to reassess the case. If Crippen was innocent, why had he fled? What could he possibly be running from if not the consequences of some terrible act? A new search of the house was ordered, a more thorough and systematic examination than Du's initial investigation had been. The searchers were now looking with different eyes, no longer willing to accept Crippen's explanations at face value, now searching for evidence of a crime rather than simply investigating a missing person. It was during the fourth and final search of the premises, conducted on the 12th and 13th of July, that the terrible truth began to emerge. Beneath the brick floor of the basement, buried in a crude grave that had been hastily prepared and inadequately concealed, the searchers discovered human remains. It was not a complete body. The head, the limbs, and the skeleton were absent, suggesting that these parts had been removed and disposed of elsewhere, or perhaps destroyed through some method of which no record remained. What remained was the torso, the central portion of the body, wrapped and hidden in the darkness beneath the house where it had lain undisturbed for nearly 6 months. The identification of the remains fell to William Wilcox, the senior scientific analyst to the Home Office. Wilcox was an expert in forensic science, one of the pioneers of this emerging discipline, and he subjected the remains to careful chemical and physical analysis. A piece of skin from the abdomen of the torso bore a distinctive scar, a mark that was identified through comparison with medical records as belonging to Cora Crippen. But even more damning than this physical identification was Wilcox's chemical analysis of the remains, which revealed the presence of hyoscine hydrobromide, also known as scopolamine, a toxic compound that is a sedative and hallucinogenic drug known to be dangerous and capable of causing death in sufficient quantities. The discovery of hyoscine in the remains was the crucial forensic evidence that would transform this case from one of a missing woman into one of murder, most deliberate and calculated. For hyoscine was not a substance that would be found naturally in a human body, nor was it a compound that would typically be present in medicines or remedies of the kind that Crippen dispensed in his work. Its presence in the remains suggested that it had been deliberately administered, that it had been used as an instrument of death. The medical evidence, combined with the physical evidence of the hidden remains and the damning flight of the accused man, painted a picture of deliberate homicide. The SS Montrose was a substantial Canadian Pacific liner, a vessel designed to carry passengers in varying degrees of comfort across the vast Atlantic Ocean. For most passengers aboard, the voyage represented either a return home or an exciting journey toward new opportunities in the Canadian colonies. For Hawley Crippen and Ethel Lenive, however, the ship represented something entirely different, a fragile lifeline and desperate gamble that distance and disguise might somehow shield them from the consequences of their actions. Crippen had booked passage for himself and Lenive in saloon class, a decision that would prove to be one of his most consequential errors of judgment. In attempting to maintain some semblance of respectability and comfort during their escape, he had chosen accommodations that placed them in proximity to the ship's captain and officers, in settings where they would more likely be observed and remembered by those in positions of authority. Had he instead secured third-class passage among the crowds of ordinary travelers, he might have escaped notice entirely, lost among the masses of people populating the lower decks. But Crippen's nature didn't incline him toward such careful strategic thinking. He was a man accustomed to maintaining appearances, to preserving a certain dignity and social standing, even when circumstances had reduced him to flight and desperation. And so he and Lenive boarded the Montrose in saloon class, where they would be more visible, more memorable, and more likely to attract the attention of those whose duty it was to observe and report on passenger behavior. Captain Henry George Kendall, the commanding officer of the Montrose, was a man of considerable experience and keen powers of observation. As the ship made its way across the Atlantic, Kendall noticed among his saloon passengers a small, mild-mannered man traveling with a young companion who wore boy's clothing and had short hair, with manner and bearing deliberately cultivated to suggest youth and masculinity. Yet something about the companion troubled Kendall's observations and experience. Despite the disguise and careful cultivation of a masculine appearance, something in the build and manner suggested to Kendall that this was not a boy at all, but a young woman. Crippen's own disguise was similarly incomplete and flawed. He had removed his distinctive mustache, an alteration that significantly changed his appearance, but he had begun to allow his beard to grow, as if attempting to establish a new identity through this unfamiliar facial hair. To Kendall, observing this small, nervous man with his newly altered appearance traveling in suspicious circumstances with a disguised young woman, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The wireless telegraph message that Kendall composed and had his telegraphist Lawrence Ernest Hughes transmit to British authorities was brief but devastating in its implications. Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Mustache taken off, growing beard, accomplice dressed as boy, manner and build undoubtedly a girl. The message was sent just before the Montrose steamed beyond the range of shipboard wireless transmission, just before the vessel would enter a communication zone where no further messages could be transmitted until land was reached again. Had Kendall delayed his wireless message by even a few minutes, the message might never have reached the authorities at all. The telegram represented the crucial intervention that would prevent Crippen's escape across the Atlantic. In London, news of Kendall's message transformed the investigation from a desperate pursuit into something far more manageable. Crippen and Leneve were aboard a specific vessel, bound for Canada, traveling at a known speed along a known route. There was no possibility of escape, no way for them to alter their course or evade the net that was now closing around them. Chief Inspector Walter Dew, the officer who had conducted the initial investigation and had been satisfied by Crippen's false explanations, now had the opportunity to redeem himself professionally. Dew immediately made arrangements to travel to Canada himself, but rather than booking passage on the Montrose, he secured a berth aboard the SS Laurentic, a White Star liner that was not only faster than the Montrose, but also capable of departing Liverpool ahead of the vessel carrying the fugitives. Dew's strategy was audacious and elegant in its simplicity. He would travel to Canada by a faster route, arriving in Quebec before Crippen, and would then board the Montrose as it entered Canadian waters. Dew traveled from Liverpool aboard the Laurentic with a Canadian police officer, the two men working in coordination with Canadian authorities. Canada, though technically independent, remained a dominion within the British Empire, and legal frameworks governing the pursuit and arrest of fugitives operated within that imperial structure. Had Crippen succeeded in reaching the United States instead of Canada, the situation would have been entirely different. The United States, though sharing cultural and historical ties with Britain, maintained its independence from British jurisdiction, and an American citizen could have claimed protection from American law. Even if recognized and apprehended, extradition proceedings would have been required, legal processes that might have taken months or years to resolve, time during which Crippen might have attempted further escape or mounted a legal defense. But Canada offered no such protection. As the Montrose entered the St. Lawrence River, approaching Quebec, Dew came aboard the vessel disguised as a ship's pilot. The disguise was itself a masterful stroke, as a pilot's uniform and cap would provide Dew with access to the bridge of the ship and the captain's quarters, areas to which ordinary passengers would never be admitted. As the Montrose approached its destination, the captain would naturally summon ship's pilots to assist in navigating the treacherous waters of the St. Lawrence, and in response to that summons, Dew and his Canadian counterpart would come aboard. Captain Kendall, having received instructions from authorities and knowing the fugitives were aboard his vessel, played his part in the carefully orchestrated drama. He invited Crippen to the bridge to meet the pilots, an invitation that seemed entirely natural and unremarkable, a courtesy extended to a saloon-class passenger as the ship approached port. Crippen, unsuspecting and anxious, accepted the invitation and made his way to the bridge. It was there, on the bridge of the Montrose, as the ship approached the Canadian shore, that the moment of final confrontation arrived. Dew removed his pilot's cap and revealed himself to the man he had been hunting. "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." For a moment there was silence, a pause that seemed to extend far longer than the seconds that actually passed. In that silence, Crippen confronted the reality of his situation, the utter futility of his flight, the impossibility of escape. All of his desperate hope that distance and disguise might somehow shield him from consequences dissolved in that single moment of recognition. "Thank God it's over," Crippen said quietly, his voice steady despite the enormity of what was transpiring. "The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." The Canadian officer moved forward, and Crippen held out his wrists in a gesture of submission, presenting them for the handcuffs that would bind him as a prisoner. Within moments, Ethel Leneve was similarly arrested and restrained, the two fugitives transformed from passengers aboard a ship into prisoners in custody. The capture of Crippen aboard the Montrose represented a triumph of modern technology and coordinated international law enforcement. The wireless telegraph, still a relatively new innovation, had proven itself capable of transcending the traditional barriers of distance and communication that had for centuries made pursuit of fugitives across the Atlantic a matter of uncertainty and chance. The Old Bailey stood as one of London's most imposing judicial buildings, a structure that embodied the authority and solemnity of British law. It was here, in the historic courtroom where countless criminals had faced judgment, that Hawley Harvey Crippen stood trial for the murder of his wife on the 18th of October, 1910. The trial would last 4 days, during which the evidence accumulated by the prosecution would be systematically presented before the court, revealing the elaborate structure of Crippen's life as founded on deception and violence. Lord Alverstone, the Lord Chief Justice himself, presided over the proceedings with the gravity and authority befitting a case that had captured the nation's imagination. The public galleries were packed with spectators eager to witness the trial of a man who had become one of the most notorious figures in recent criminal history. Newspapers assembled their reporters to document the trial proceedings for audiences whose fascination with the case seemed insatiable. The prosecution's case began with testimony from pathologists, experts in the examination of human remains who had conducted the scientific analysis that would form the cornerstone of the state's case against Crippen. One of these experts was Bernard Spilsbury, a name that would become synonymous with forensic pathology in the 20th century and a pioneer in the emerging discipline of scientific crime investigation. Yet Spilsbury's testimony, while damaging to Crippen, also revealed the limitations of forensic science in this era. The remains discovered in the basement were so badly decomposed and fragmentary that Spilsbury was forced to acknowledge he couldn't definitively identify the torso or even determine with certainty whether the remains belonged to a male or female body. The remains were incomplete, lacking the head and limbs that would have provided more certain identification, and the passage of nearly 6 months in the damp basement had taken considerable toll on the tissue and bone. Despite these limitations, Spilsbury identified a piece of skin bearing what he claimed to be an abdominal scar, a distinctive mark consistent with Cora's medical history. Cora had undergone an abdominal operation in the past, and this scar, if indeed it was a scar, would have served as a means of identifying the remains as belonging to her. The prosecution also presented evidence of the large quantities of scopolamine found in the remains, a toxic compound identified through William Wilcox's careful chemical analysis. More damning still was evidence that Crippen had purchased this drug from a local chemist prior to Cora's disappearance, suggesting premeditation and deliberate intent. The scopolamine, a substance not typically used in legitimate medical practice, had been acquired by Crippen and apparently used as an instrument of death. The defense, led by barrister Alfred Taubin, mounted a vigorous, if ultimately unsuccessful, challenge to the prosecution's case. Taubin's strategy was to cast doubt upon the identification of the remains and suggest alternative explanations for the evidence presented. The defense maintained that Cora had indeed fled to the United States with her lover Bruce Miller, and that the remains buried in the basement must have been placed there by a previous owner of the house. Crippen and his wife, the defense asserted, had only occupied the house since 1905, and therefore couldn't be responsible for remains that might have been buried years earlier. It was a desperate argument depending upon the jury accepting highly improbable coincidences, but it was the argument the defense was compelled to present. Much of the defense's challenge focused upon the identification of the abdominal scar that Spilsbury had identified as evidence of Cora's identity. Tobin argued that what Spilsbury had identified as scar tissue was merely folded skin, a natural feature of decomposed tissue rather than evidence of prior surgical intervention. The defense pointed out that the disputed tissue bore hair follicles, something that scar tissue would not possess, as scars lack the normal structures of undamaged skin. Spilsbury was forced to acknowledge that sebaceous glands appeared at the ends of the tissue, but not in the middle, a detail that added to the ambiguity surrounding the identification. The prosecution presented additional evidence that reinforced its theory of guilt, evidence that seemed circumstantial but cumulatively painted a devastating picture. A piece of a man's pajama top was introduced, supposedly from a pair that Cora had given to Crippen approximately a year before her death. The pajama bottoms of this pair had been found in Crippen's bedroom, but the top had been missing, buried instead with the remains in the basement. The fragment bore the manufacturer's label, Jones Bros, and testimony from a company representative established that this particular style and design was not sold prior to 1908. This meant the pajama top couldn't have been manufactured before 1908, placing its manufacture within the period when the Crippens occupied the house and precisely within the year before Cora's death. It was difficult to imagine more damaging evidence, the pajamas placing the remains in the house during the exact period when Cora disappeared. The prosecution also presented curlers and bleached hair found with the remains, hair consistent with Cora's known appearance and color. These details, while individually perhaps not conclusive, taken together formed a pattern of evidence pointing toward the conclusion that the remains were those of Cora Crippen. Throughout the trial proceedings, even as the verdict was rendered and sentence passed, Crippen displayed a remarkable absence of remorse regarding his wife. His concern was not for the woman he had murdered, but rather for the reputation of Ethel Leneve, the woman he had loved and who had stood by him through his flight and capture. Even facing the ultimate consequences, Crippen's thoughts remained focused on his concern for Leneve's honor and standing. The jury, after hearing the evidence over 4 days, required only 27 minutes of deliberation before returning with a verdict of guilty. The speed of deliberation suggested that the evidence, despite the defense's challenges, had seemed overwhelming to the jurors. Crippen had been convicted of the murder of his wife, and the sentence that followed was inevitable, death by hanging. Ethel Leneve faced separate charges, accused of being an accessory after the fact, of knowingly harboring a fugitive and aiding his escape. Yet the jury found her not guilty of this charge, acquitting her on grounds that her involvement had been limited to her personal relationship with Crippen rather than any deliberate conspiracy to obstruct justice. She would be released from custody, her life spared, though forever marked by her association with one of the most notorious crimes of the era. More than a century after Hawley Harvey Crippen was hanged at Pentonville Prison, questions began to emerge regarding the certainty of his guilt. These questions came not from sentimentality or romantic notions of a wronged man, but from the careful application of modern scientific techniques to evidence that had been preserved since 1910. These questions didn't emerge immediately, but rather gradually, as various observers and legal professionals reflected on the trial proceedings and the evidence presented. Dornford Yates, a junior barrister who participated in the proceedings at the Old Bailey, later recorded his recollections in his memoirs, noting that Lord Alverstone had taken an unusual step at the prosecution's request. The Lord Chief Justice had refused to provide Crippen's defense counsel with a copy of the sworn affidavit that had been used to issue the arrest warrant. This was a remarkable breach of standard legal procedure, a denial of information that would normally be considered essential to mounting an adequate defense. The judge accepted the prosecution's argument that withholding the document wouldn't prejudice the accused's case without any challenge or objection. Yates revealed that he knew the reason why the prosecution had sought this withholding of evidence, but despite the passage of decades, he refused to disclose what he knew. The suppression of this document suggested that something in the affidavit might have been damaging to the prosecution's case, that some detail or inconsistency might have undermined the narrative that had been presented to the jury. Yet what that detail might have been would remain forever obscured, hidden behind the wall of judicial secrecy that had been erected during the trial itself. In October 2007, decades after these initial doubts had been raised, modern forensic science offered the possibility of decisive answers. David Foran, a forensic scientist at Michigan State University, announced the results of a comprehensive investigation into the remains that had been preserved since Crippen's trial. Foran's team had obtained mitochondrial DNA from relatives of Cora Crippen, specifically 3 living great-nieces, and had used this genetic information to establish a mitochondrial DNA haplotype against which the remains could be compared. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited through the maternal line, would be shared among all relatives descended from a common female ancestor, and thus could serve as a basis for identifying whether the remains belonged to a member of Cora's maternal family line. The research team compared the mitochondrial DNA extracted from a microscope slide containing flesh taken from the torso with the DNA profile established from Cora's known relatives. The results were startling. The mitochondrial DNA did not match. The remains found in Crippen's cellar were not those of Cora Crippen. Moreover, the research team subjected the flesh sample to analysis using a highly sensitive assay of the Y chromosome, a genetic marker present only in males. The results demonstrated that the flesh sample on the slide was male tissue, not female. The body that had been buried in the basement of 39 Hilldrop Crescent was not that of Cora at all, but rather that of a man. The implications of this finding were extraordinary, calling into question the fundamental premise upon which Crippen's conviction had been based. Critics of the research pointed out significant limitations in the methodology that had been employed. The journalist David Aronovich raised questions about the reliability of the Y chromosome assay that had been used to determine the sex of the remains. He noted that the American research team was using a technique that was very new and done only by this team, a procedure that wasn't widely adopted or validated by other researchers. Moreover, the team was working with a single, century-old microscope slide, a sample that the team leader himself had described as less than optimal. Using such limited and questionable material to overturn a verdict rendered at a formal trial seemed to Aronovich to be a proceeding worthy of considerable skepticism. Foran responded to these criticisms by insisting that tests showed unequivocally that the remains were male, though the debate continued regarding whether the methodology employed was sufficiently reliable to support such a definitive conclusion. Additional complications arose regarding the physical evidence that had been preserved since the original trial. Traces of blonde hair that had been found in curlers at the crime scene were now maintained in the Metropolitan Police's Crime Museum, preserved as part of the historical record of one of Britain's most famous criminal cases. Researchers involved in investigating Crippen's potential innocence requested to be provided with samples of this hair for modern DNA testing. Their request was denied repeatedly, preventing the kind of comprehensive genetic analysis that might have settled the question of the remains' identity with absolute certainty. In December 2009, the UK's Criminal Cases Review Commission, an official body empowered to review potentially wrongful convictions, carefully examined all aspects of the Crippen case. After their review, the Commission declared that the Court of Appeal would not hear the case for purposes of posthumously pardoning Crippen. The official position remained that the evidence, despite its inconsistencies and limitations, was insufficient to overturn the original verdict and declare a man executed more than a century earlier to have been innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. Thus the question of Crippen's guilt remained unresolved, suspended between the certainty of the historical verdict and the doubts raised by modern scientific analysis. Was he indeed a murderer who had killed his wife, dismembered her body, and buried the evidence in his basement? Or was he a man convicted on circumstantial evidence, whose trial had been compromised by the suppression of crucial documents, whose conviction rested upon identification evidence that modern science now called into serious question? The truth, it seemed, lay permanently beyond the reach of definitive proof, lost in the passage of more than a century and the limitations of the evidence that had survived to the present day.